we're going to go into the agenda. So the way that we're going to run this tour is we're going to talk about the ancient history, what happened at Wayfair very early in our company, and then the more recent history, the last 2 or 3 years when we've experienced some pretty explosive growth. We're going to talk about where we are right now, which is like what me and Martin are working on in UI testing and how that's going. Then we'll talk about what we plan on doing next, which all of this is involving some SauceLabs infrastructure and how we make the best use of everything that we could have at our disposal from Sauce. I'm Gary. This is Martin. We work together and have worked together for a couple of years now. He's been here. I've been here the entire time he's been here, and I joined maybe 2 or 3 months before him.
I'm a lead engineer on the core funnel automation team. So basically we have our storefront space and then split into separate verticals. So we have a automation team that kind of spreads across core funnel and is starting to expand into the rest of the verticals of storefront that I lead the app side for, and one of our attendees, Chandra, leads the website for that. So yeah, we focus on bringing automation to all of storefront.
So Wayfair's vision statement as a company is to be a technology leader, reinventing the way people shop for their homes. We take that seriously in our own engineering teams by pushing ourselves to get out and talk about technology and how we use it. Hello, that's why we're here. We're happy to have you. Wayfair has a worldwide presence, as we have on the map, with a headquarters in Boston, headquarters in London, and a headquarters in Berlin. Big thing that we pride ourselves on is being able to provide 2-day shipping on many of our freight products throughout the US and through Europe. In the past 5 years, our engineering organization has grown from being 700 people distributed across these 3 places to almost 3,000 people. So I'm sure all of us can imagine that a 700-person team has a lot of different needs than a 3,000-person team. There are some practices and growing pains that we experienced on the way, and that's the focus of this talk. To frame it in a way that's tangible for everybody, I wanted to talk about the organizational players. If you can go ahead a slide, Mark. Great. So in the organization, we have Wayfair Engineering up at the top. And there are more than this, but for the purposes of this talk, we really only need to talk about transportation, which does mostly like services and talking to one another. There's internal management sites, which are mostly internally facing UIs. Storefront, which is what you probably think of when you think of Wayfair.com. It's how you buy stuff from us. And then the partner sites, which is like vendor sites, analytics, ways that we monitor our business and that people who supply our products can also monitor the business. These services all benefit from some form of UI testing, but to explain where we are in that journey, it's really important for you to have some technical background and to cover that ancient history. So now I'll hand it off to Martin. We're going to go through the beginnings of where we started at Wayfair, and I'll let him say the rest.
Yeah, so Wayfair used to, and to an extent still does, have a very large monolithic repo to house most of our PHP code. Other than some of the code-related and kit-related side effects that are caused by a project of this size, 2 large consequences of this were that deploys took a very long time and there were frequent rollbacks. Being an organization that prides itself on continuous deployment with many deploys and many thousands of lines of code released every day, a deploy process that takes upwards of 40 minutes is not ideal. In addition to the length of time of deploys, the intertwined cross-functionality of the code base, as I mentioned, caused frequent rollbacks, which for reasons that likely don't need explaining is also not ideal. And these 2 issues on their own, but especially when combined, meant that blocking UI tests, which were running on a shaky UI testing framework, which we will get into, adding time to the deploy process was not feasible. So I'm going to hand it off to Gary to talk about how we handle stability in ancient history using stability captains.
Thanks, Martin. Little Easter egg for any of us that are at Wayfair or maybe have seen our problems before. On the previous slide, we had a little upside down couch to talk about when the site is down. If you ever see on Wayfair that there's an upside down couch, it means that we have some kind of problem or outage. In a software engineering workflow based around a monolith, we found that it was difficult to have meaningful accountability. We found this because there are a lot of shared code paths. There's a lot of direct access to databases rather than using like a data layer. And small changes that you make for your team might have wide-reaching implications because other people were depending on that code without you being aware of that. So putting aside how we did the testing of that for a moment, we depended on stability captains, and I want to provide an example of how that worked. And for that example, I want you to imagine Maddie, who was my first boss when I came to Wayfair. She also happened to be a stability captain. Functionality and context was not shared across engineering teams at the company in any meaningful way. So stability captains would build rapport with folks around the organization to raise issues as they came up. So imagine we have some kind of test failure incident and a stability captain has to triage the issue. Next slide. Yep, there you go. So in an ideal situation, Maddie would get a notification that something was up, like there was some kind of problem, and go directly to the person responsible on the first try. That was like the idea, is that we'd be able to do this with captains. The issue is that with bad practice that was being done throughout the organization, like I mentioned, accessing data directly, we had difficult architecture, and the sheer scale of the company, even at 700 people, was a lot for Maddie to have to coordinate between multiple teams to understand why something going down or changing would cause these wide-reaching implications. And while she's figuring this out, the site is still down, and we have a difficult time getting it back up because maybe a rollback is not easy to do, and sometimes it's hard to get a good version back up. So it was a pragmatic decision that worked for a small company, but even at the scale that we were reaching when Martin and I started coming along, it was not a valid solution. My hypothesis on why we would have trouble here is mostly against three main ideas. One of those is manual testing, because we depended so heavily on manual testing that we did not consider that we could have lower effort and higher leverage solutions. So if you put all of your testing investment into one place, it won't work. And we were basically expecting that manual testing could catch everything, which was just not a reasonable expectation. Second, we had practically no standard practice, even for the small amount of testing that we did do. There was not a lot of coordination happening between teams on like what good testing looked like and how we could do it effectively. It was a free-for-all to validate your own changes and make sure that you were not breaking something in production. And if somebody else had their stuff broken because of your changes, you had no accountability for that, which, again, we tried to fix with stability captains, but we just went through that. That could be a problem. The last part is that there was a lot of duplicate effort happening because people would notice these problems and try to fix them for themselves, but wouldn't try to fix them for the organization at large. And so like tests became incompatible with one another. Sometimes libraries would conflict. And when you're living in a monolith and a monorepo, everything has to live in harmony. Otherwise, nothing works. So to actually create this standard practice, encourage a positive testing culture, and reduce the duplicate effort, we needed to invest in a software engineering platform. And that's kind of where development platforms started stepping in there. And that's where we enter recent history. In recent history, we were targeting specific talent pools. We invested more in software platforms, and we got together to talk about what standard practice could look like. So in recent history, development platforms was tackling these big problems. We cared about fixing the testing platform and about getting into smaller microservices. And so I was on the team that took on testing as an engineering goal. One avenue that we went down in this monolith, this PHP monolith, was to use a UI testing framework that engineers felt like they could get their arms around. So a PHP framework called Codeception was developed by Facebook, and we could take advantage of that just by putting it and using it for our purposes. And that was working pretty well. But as people started adopting it, we noticed that Selenium also had a necessity for being standardized across the company. We needed a standard way for Selenium to work because engineers across the company would stand up their own Selenium instances. That would obviously have networking issues where they couldn't reach certain services they needed to, or it would just have stability problems where you need Selenium version 2 and instead you have Selenium version 15 and then it breaks. So we leaned on SauceLabs that was one of the basic reasons why we got started, was to have Selenium as a service. But we found that the traceability of these tests, the ability to replay failing tests and see exactly where it failed and what we were seeing on the page at the time, as well as that ability to programmatically spin up our tests, was great for a platform team like us to provide to engineers. Because our development was easy on creating the platform, but that we could then surface and make simple to the engineers at our organization. So one of the biggest things that we got from using SauceLabs was actually SauceConnect Tunnels, which I want to talk about now. Yep, there we go. Developers would depend on these Selenium clusters they would set up themselves. So instead, we set up clusters that would never, ever move, so that if we had to connect to certain services, we would only ever have to do it once. And more than that, we also were able to do this across the dev infrastructure that we created. We had the staging infrastructure, and we had production infrastructure that people could target separately for different kinds of testing. So these SauceConnect tunnels made it simple to provide one interface for anybody running any Codeception tests to access the services that they needed to with the networking and security restrictions that comes along with that. This has continued to be one of the biggest draws for us to SauceLabs, because most other testing solutions that provide like a Selenium cloud require that you basically whitelist, or I'm sorry, that's allow list all of the IPs that they need to be able to run tests from where they are. So this solution that we have in front of us, where we can go from anywhere in the company practically to the connection, the SauceConnect tunnels, and use a Selenium environment to run against whatever Wayfair service we need, makes our engineering team happy, makes our security team happy, and definitely makes us as a platform team extremely happy. The maintenance is pretty minimal, and we only have to connect those things one time, and then we can leave it. So I want to pause there. I definitely just dumped a lot of context about SauceConnect and SauceLabs. I want to talk more about the Codeception system that we built, and I'll leave that to Martin as the person who used it way more than I did.
So yeah, backing up a bit and kind of connecting the Codeception test runner, which you see on the right side in the top as the entry point from the last slide, to provide sort of a high-level view, we had this tool called the Codeception UI. And that's a user interface that allows testers and engineers the ability to configure and run any combination of test suites on a regular schedule or on demand in any given environment. And one of these predefined suites was what we called our deploy suite. The suite was run before every deploy, but because of its flakiness, it was not blocking, and it was considered more of a non-serious pulse check. The original deploy suite was made up of tests that any one person could decide were important enough to run before every deploy. This suite had basically no permissions on it. You could just add and remove stuff at will. Didn't matter who you were. This meant that a lot of tests were not vetted and that there was no accountability when they failed. So starting in 2019, an initiative was launched to assert that all tests on the deploy suite was fully vetted, which led us to our deploy staging suite, which you can see in the center of the slide. We would vet these tests by running them, I think it was about 50 times a day over the course of a week. And if your test got at least a 99% pass rate, assuming that your failures were non-legitimate bugs or were legitimate bugs, we would allow this test into the deploy suite. And the idea behind this was to ensure that tests were not flaky, that they had proper accountability, that we had proper points of contact when we put them in the deploy suite, to make the deploy suite an actual blocking thing that we could rely on and give us a reliable indicator of the health of the deploy. So while the deploy suite was being updated, we ran a parallel initiative to overhaul the Codeception framework itself. This began with an effort to identify ownership of tests and page objects by team, and then work with those teams to update their respective page objects within the whole page object model. Our model repo has a structure which splits out features into what we called applications. As pages and their supporting features were updated, we also mirrored the existing application structure to bring it in line with feature code. This was done so that engineers could come in and say, oh, my test failed, and I know that it failed at this point in this piece of the folder structure, therefore it has something to do with this page that mirrors a folder structure in the application code. After the major overhaul, we spread knowledge via release notes and lunch and learns to get engineers excited about using the new framework and reinvigorated about UI testing in general. And while we were doing all this, we also looked at our hiring process to make sure we were getting experienced testers in the door. This included prioritizing hiring test engineers over manual testers, ensuring teams that required personnel had engineers with the proper levels that matched their needs, and providing a path to test engineering from manual testing. The idea behind this push was to ensure Wayfair was able to scale its testing into the future and provide growth opportunities for current and future testers. And as test engineers started to get hired and identify each other across Wayfair, we grew into this sort of test engineer working group sort of naturally. And soon after its inception, we had several dozen members. This group's goals were to bring together test engineers and manual testers across the company, surface testing issues and blockers, build framework and testing solutions together. We covered a broad range of topics such as improvements to Codeception, Selenium, Cypress, accessibility testing, app UI testing, resourcing needs, and the interview and hiring process. So now I'm going to hand it off to Gary to talk about the role of development platforms in the test engineering working group.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I want to pull over for a second and just talk about development platforms and the role that we played in that test engineer working group, because obviously as a platform team, I'm sure some of us can relate that you want to be involved, but you don't want to give the impression of like forcing anything in any of these ecosystems. You want people to express to you exactly what it is that they need and how they can work most effectively, but sitting there and giving your opinion might be too much. So we would normally attend these working groups and give some vague ideas about what we think we could work on, but source ideas mostly from the working group so that they could say, hey, we think that we might need this. Can we try that out? And we can turn something on, or we can, build something brief that just allows a couple of people to try out a function, see if it works, see if it brings value, and get that quick feedback from the team directly. And in a lot of lean software development, we call that the build, measure, learn cycle. That was the way that we tried to iterate on the Codeception platform. That was the way that we came up with the SauceConnect Tunnels. And that was the best way, I think, for dev plats at the time to build real empathy with people like Martin, because then we actually understood what the problems were that we were facing on a daily basis as a company. So that's my interjection as a development platformer into the otherwise very fruitful talk about QA engineering. So I'm going to hand it back to Martin to talk about QA and engineering merging as they are right now at Wayfair.
Yeah, so to talk a bit about our current state, at the beginning of 2020, a decision was made to merge the QA organization into the engineering organization. This allowed for a better alignment of business needs, such as an alignment on testing direction and company growth, and additional resources for test engineering. Some teams were given embedded test engineers, and a new team called Core Funnel Automation, which is the team that I'm on, was created to drive test engineering in the core funnel space of Wayfair's storefront. This encompasses a large portion, like most of the features that you would see when you're on storefront are in core funnel. So one of the roles of our team is to drive the effort to find newer and better testing solutions. We identified Cypress and Selenium as two tools that would be imperative to scale the future of Wayfair's automated testing effort. We embed on and work with teams within Storefront to use these tools and find a line of best fit that will produce the best testing return on investment. This has led to proper standards creation, better collaboration, more thorough communication between teams on their testing efforts. And as we started to grow this, we started to realize that more teams were relying more heavily on Cypress than they were on Codeception. And in fact, a lot of these Codeception tests were just failing because they hadn't been maintained for a while. We have Jenkins jobs that run these tests on a recurring basis, and we started to sort of identify people weren't looking at or maintaining these, and because they were relying on Cypress, and it was a much more stable solution than Codeception. So early in 2020, Development Platforms was involved in an effort to remove any Jenkins jobs that had long-term failures. And I believe the timeline was any job that had consistently failed for the last 3 months. The removal of these jobs removed 1/3 of Wayfair's internal networking traffic. So we were really hitting the top of a lot of charts with our networking traffic. And as you'll see in the graphs on the next slide, how drastically we improved our traffic and our metrics by dropping these jobs. So in addition to this effort, as Gary and I will discuss, during the Christmas season, just last December 2020, we discovered that a large chunk of teams previously using Codeception, not even just within Storefront, were no longer using it. So people who weren't even using Cypress were just sort of not using Codeception anymore. An investigation led to the removal of 80,000 lines of code and 100 test suites. So I'm going to hand this off to Gary to talk about the numbers and the metrics we actually see from this change.
Yeah, I wanted this slide to be in so that we had a relative scale, because I think it's easy to hear 80,000 lines of code and be like, yeah, whatever. But how big was the repo really, and how much of a change did that really make? So the fact that it removed, I love that deleting code is one of the healthiest things you can do, I think is what somebody just said. I totally agree, and we get a lot of schadenfreude from being able to do that. We actually pulled some numbers from our SauceConnect dashboards and from our wonderful friends at SauceLabs that were able to show us what our usage looked like from the time that we turned off the suites. So I will give everybody in the audience 3 guesses when we actually turn them off. You can see the sharp decline in the error rate as well as the jobs and minutes that we were allocating. The amount that we got billed versus how much we were actually using is just pretty incredible to see that drop off. And we are getting a lot of like less usage than what we were expecting, where we budgeted for being able to be at 100%, probably 75% of the time. And now we know that most of that was because there were people who were running tests that either aren't maintained or had been failing for so long that it was kind of irrelevant. So that feels really good to see that we made some kind of meaningful change that we can actually like measure. But there's some pain that you'll feel as a company that isn't measurable through these metrics necessarily. And to exemplify what that pain feels like, I want to move through what the deploy train process looked like for our PHP monolith. So the first thing that you would do when you wanted to deploy some code using the monolith at Wayfair would be to get on the deploy train. At this point, you've already run some tests, but you need to put it to be vetted against what we call the integrator. An extremely, extremely creative name. What it does is it takes all these branches and it integrates them. So the first thing that it does is it does that integrating, and then it will make sure that there's no code conflicts and that there's no merge conflicts between those branches. After it's done that merge, it will go into the unit or integration testing. Sometimes both. It really depends on what got changed. We do dynamic allocation of what tests need to happen based on what changes got made. So then we will go and deploy to a canary environment. If anybody's not familiar with what canary is, it's a subset of your production application environment that you use for testing new changes. So we'll put integrator changes onto a canary environment first and start running some smoke tests and some UI tests that we would normally do against this very separate, very isolated piece of our infrastructure. And then the train's done. You've made it. You're in production. But I want to restate that this branch and this UI testing can feel like it's just another step along the way. But if we have teams that aren't maintaining what that code is and the integrity of those tests, like we already saw with the Jenkins jobs, that can block people being able to get meaningful changes out. That can block critical changes to fix the site. And we had put the onus on app teams to own these things. And I think over time, it became less and less of a priority as we got less of an appetite for this really heavyweight codeception testing and more for Cypress and Selenium directly, or maybe some other kinds of tests. So it was Christmas 2020, where Martin and I were just sitting around doing absolutely nothing as usual. And I sent him a message where I said, hey, Martin, what's up with the deploy suite? I noticed that there's only a couple of tests running in it. We normally had anywhere from like 12 to I think the largest was probably 13 or 15. And then we were down to 3 or 4, which struck me as like, why do we even have them at that point if we're deprecating them that much? Martin had more connections than I did to the people who actually own those tests. And he said, yeah, it seems like those people don't even need them anymore. They don't actually depend on them for the integrity of their app. They have other ways that they're validating that. I said, great, so we could just kind of remove them. And so we did. Taking that step out was something that we got plenty of emoji clapping hands reacts. And if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, I'm sure they would have thrown us a parade, because people were very thrilled about the fact that we were not blocking on these kind of flaky tests, and we were starting to rely more on the types of testing that teams were actively engaging in and maintaining. We hypothesize now that this was related to Codeception. not related to SauceLabs. I want to be totally clear about that. I think that we learned some lessons about development platforms maintaining application code. But for now, it's important to note that we were able to remove this blocking step in addition to all of these suites that were taking up bandwidth, and that sped up the deploy train. So now we've told you all we want to tell you about the current state at Wayfair. We're going to transition into the future state and what's happening next. Big one is Cypress and SauceLabs. Cypress is a tool that is built, in their words, as a test runner built for humans. They say that testing has been broken for too long and it's time to fix it. Our developers of Wayfair, at Wayfair, have definitely latched on to that mantra, saying that Cypress is better than any other tool they've used for UI testing, including the one that we developed, which hurts, but fair. Running in CI, SauceLabs still provides all of the value that we got from them previously, but now we can use it with Cypress as well to provide a consistent experience for people that are developing on their laptop and still expect to see those videos when they get into production and they get into testing in CI. Part of that building that platform is fueling with the right use cases. So we're actively seeking cases where people have had success with Cypress. Martin was able to give us a great one, which is a case study with our Wayfair credit card team. So really low stakes team.
Yeah, so currently the core funnel automation team is providing coverage for automated accessibility testing through Cypress. Previously, a lot of our accessibility testing was done manually, which takes up a lot of resources and time. So one of our other attendees, David, has helped provide a lot of accessibility testing across core funnel already. And as as we currently have coverage, we've begun expanding to other verticals within Storefront outside of core funnel. And this includes a project with the Wayfair credit card team to build automated accessibility coverage for them. So really important to have this because of equal lending laws. As we continue expanding our automated accessibility testing and including external partners such as our credit card and financing providers, because Wayfair doesn't obviously do the financing directly, we've been leaning into SauceLabs Cypress integration to improve access to engineers across the company to run these tests, see metrics, and identify trends.
Awesome. All right, so that was a lot. I want to put this all together and state some takeaways for anybody who managed to stay with us this long. Thank you so much for listening. I know that we blew a lot of technical information at you. First, I want to give a shout out to the people at SauceLabs. We really do appreciate you partnering with us on this. Everybody on the call right now, as well as people who couldn't make it, like Jamal Hoosier, Jack King, Josh Grant, and we have plenty of folks from Wayfair who helped out with this as well. Being able to find these solutions in the industry has been incredible, like from Codeception over to Cypress, like that's been extremely helpful. And as we've learned from Codeception, stepping into the platform space can leave a lot of people disappointed. So with Selenium and Sauce, we're actually able to give that power back to our developers just by focusing on being able to keep those services up while having time to maintain the platform and keep it running smoothly and stay out of the framework business where we don't have to mandate anything for the rest of the company. So now let's shift to the takeaways, where the things that I would love if everybody could take away from this. I'm sure you have your own, but we started with Codeception and Selenium. We were baking everything ourselves, and we moved into a page object model in SauceLabs where we had practitioners that actually knew what they were doing, able to help us maintain Codeception and use SauceLabs for the stuff that was really like, you don't want to have to maintain a bunch of OSs and browsers and ability to maintain those browsers. Just use SauceLabs. It's better. SauceLabs was able to stay even during some turmoil that we had with QA and engineering merging. That was a weird time, but SauceLabs was always consistent and able to work. I think advice that I would give myself that I think is a good takeaway is like use what works. Don't force any particular solution. Keep QA and engineering tight. I'm glad that we did that because being able to get your QAs and testers talking with the people who develop features is important. And if you're creating a development platform at your own company, remember that you are part of a platform team before you're part of an app team. Being able to provide things that help developers move faster is more important than being able to basically be a developer yourself. Great. That is our whole presentation.
Thank you so much, Martin and Gary. That was a great presentation. And yes, we have quite a few questions here from the audience. I'm going to start with some of the ones that we got earlier on. So One of the questions here is just around when you were getting set up with the SauceConnect Tunnels, Did you get any pushback from your team, from the security team on those shared tunnels?
That is a great question, and I actually advocate heavily for the SauceConnect solution over other VPC peering solutions because we got virtually no pushback because we were able to just give them, these are the machines we're going to use. That makes them so much more auditable for anybody on the security engineering team that's worried about what people might use Selenium for. The fact that it's in our infrastructure, you can restrict what it can talk out to, so it's not reaching out to github.com to download a cryptocurrency miner. It's not doing anything silly like that. That really did a lot for our sec engine and keeps us from waking up in the middle of the night as well.
That's great. And so moving into some of the newer technology that you're using, how do you separate responsibilities between Selenium and Cypress?
I'm going to take that to mean what should Selenium be doing and what should Cypress be doing. So correct me if I'm answering this question wrong. But so I think Cypress helps us shift testing to the left because we can do a lot more interjection and sort of in the middle proxying and stuff like that so that, we don't have to be making a ton of networking calls and tests can go really quick. We can just provide dummy data in Cypress, which helps us, get developers to run these tests closer to when they're actually developing the code before they push it out. And because it can run very quickly, we can do a lot of iterations. So if we have like 10,000 of the same page type that we want to test, Cypress can be really helpful. Whereas we could use something like Selenium to test one of this page type, for example, and get sort of an overall health across the board, whereas we can use Cypress to iterate very, very quickly. Cypress is also better, in my opinion, for accessibility testing because a lot of accessibility stuff is going to rely on the front end through JavaScript and HTML versus whatever you're running on the back end to actually generate this. So in essence, Selenium for a broad reach, Cypress for just a ton of iteration.
Do you use test analytics or any BI data as you're prioritizing tests or integrated into that testing pipeline?
So yeah, we have a lot of metrics that we track across all of Wayfair, but especially in storefront, about what devices our customers are using, what browsers they're using, what pieces of the application they hit on the most. So we use a lot of internally built tools as well as things like Grafana to track what people are doing to determine where our testing fits first.
We left out a lot of the BI stuff, not only because we shouldn't be talking about all of our business intelligence in a public forum like this, but also because it's something that we do implicitly for pretty much everything in the Wayfair business. Like, I think when I joined, we expressed it as Wayfair uses data as a barometer, and being able to look at what are the biggest business issues that we're having and trying to solve those with UI testing was some of our really early thinking. Making sure that we're doing the right kind of testing now has been our focus as well. But to talk about like which metrics we would use to say what we needed to be able to test, checkout was obviously a really big one, being able to see order volume at a certain point and see that the revenue was not taking a gigantic hit after we deployed a particular change. Those were all really big indicators that we could formalize and direct issues better using UI testing. So if checkout's not working, does it work for our bots? Or did we just have a drop in volume because of something else? Maybe there's something else broken in that pipeline.
Another question I have here is around the pandemic, around how, you already had a distributed team, but how did an even more distributed team affect your ability to communicate or to move releases faster?
I'll speak from my perspective, and then Martin can give the perspective as a practitioner. I'm giving the perspective almost as like, you can think of me as a proxy for developer infrastructure. Like I know this is a really loaded word, and I'm sorry that I'm saying it because I feel like it's bad, but DevOps team that we use at Wayfair, DevPlats was really focused in making sure that we could scale when we all had to go home last March. And we had almost no difference in our working style because we use Slack a lot at this company. I'm often surprised that people respond to my Slacks. I have personally Slacked the CTO about something and he's responded in a reasonable amount of time. So being a remote friendly company from the beginning was helpful. And I think that a lot of that we have to owe from the fact that we do communicate across Berlin and Boston, and we have people in California and everywhere. So it wasn't a huge problem for us, but I'd love to hear Martin's perspective if anything changed as somebody who works in storefront.
Yeah, so I would say that it was a bit of a dynamic shift with everybody going home at once, especially because during the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people were like, oh, we're only going to be home for 2 weeks. And then it quickly grew into over a year. I think we just hit our year mark from when Wayfair went home like a couple weeks ago. Thank you for the thumbs up, Gary. So it was a kind of a big dynamic shift, especially because this happened around the time when QA and engineering merged. So there was a lot of people moving around, and then all of them had to work from home. I had actually already gone remote because Wayfair has a pretty good work from home policy, and within Storefront had started to open up engineering and engineers themselves to being remote employees. So I think for some people, there wasn't a huge shift because they were already working from home. And a lot of these teams that had people on them working remotely had already gotten used to doing video calls for remote stand-ups, even if they were all sitting next to each other. So yeah, I think we handled it fairly well, even though within the first couple of weeks, there was a very big dynamic shift on Storefront with all of this happening at once.
Another question here, gonna see if this makes sense when read out to you guys, but how, in a cultural sense, how do you encourage the transition away from blocking UI tests towards a more asynchronous testing process?
So the investment that we had been putting in Selenium and Codeception was able to be pretty reasonably distributed, coincidentally with when Wayfair wanted to get into microservices. So being able to deploy asynchronously meant that we had to be able to develop and run tests asynchronously. And so some of the critical functions of the site just get regular testing, like UI and accessibility testing on a schedule of when we would normally be in the office. So it runs a lot during the day and then it runs not so much when we're offline. But then we had a significant investment in other testing tools that are outside the scope of Selenium. So think things like contract testing and think things like integration testing. I won't get into specific technologies just because it's not relevant to this talk, but we did do a lot of investment from the development platforms standpoint in being able to use stuff that verifies at different levels of the stack rather than putting it all on manual or UI testing.
Yeah, to speak to that sort of from a storefront perspective, and I want to talk a bit about just sort of asynchronous testing in general and getting engineers involved in testing. So not just with automated testing, but with manual QA as well. We have a lot of very smart QA people who have been in the business for a while at Wayfair, and that's incredibly helpful because these people are able to embed on teams now because we've merged QA and engineering. To provide a QA perspective, I know as an example, one team dropped from having at least 2 criticals a week to having 0 pretty consistently when they got a very good QA on their team to install testing best practices and show that doing your testing earlier in the process is going to be a lot more helpful and we're going to lose a lot less money. And then as we start to embed on teams, we can show how much time we are saving manual testing. So developers are happy when they are able to run their tests farther to the left in the development process, and they can see, oh, our QAs are taking less time to test our tickets. Things are getting out faster. We can get more sprint work done because we have started doing our testing earlier. And because we've provided a more stable testing solution, that's been very helpful in getting people to do things asynchronously.
That's it for the questions today. So I want to thank you again for presenting. That was a really insightful presentation. Thanks for showing us what's going on behind the scenes at Wayfair for your company to deliver such a great online platform.